Welcome. Uh, Hello, everyone. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center. Very happy to have you here for our virtual reading group. We are continuing today with Hannah Arendt's, sort of earliest book, outside of The Love of St. Augustine. Her Habilitation that she wrote, Rahel Barnhagen. And we've been reading it for about 5 weeks, and a real theme has emerged that many of us have found compelling or interesting, which is this idea that Rahel, this Jewess that she is writing about from the late 18th and early 19th centuries, was someone who was deeply unhappy in the world, was afraid of the world, found the world as a Jewess in Germany in this period to be one of struggle and unhappiness and difficulty, and that Rahel fled from the world into thinking. And it's this turn towards introspection, towards thinking, towards creating a subjective reality that becomes so much of the center of Hannah Arendt's concern in her telling of this life. And this is fascinating for those of you who know a little bit of Hannah Arendt, because you'll know that in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt argues that one of the core features of totalitarian government is the turn to introspection, the turn away from a common world, a world in which we have standards of truth and right and wrong, to a world where we create a world that we believe ourselves, a world without facts. And that one of the core definitions of totalitarianism for Arendt is that it's a movement that creates a coherent fictional reality where people who are unable or unwilling to confront the difficulty and pain and unhappiness of the world prefer instead a false world, a coherently fictional world that gives them a sense of meaning and purpose. And it's this turn away from the real to the fictional that Arendt says was well, it's not that it was the cause of totalitarianism, it's more that totalitarianism could exist as a new form of government in a world with such lonely, devastated, and abandoned people. And in a world of such lonely, devastated, and abandoned people, they would crave what the fictional reality of totalitarianism offered them. Also in her book, The Human Condition, which is a book about the way humans have been conditioned and how that condition may be changing, one of the core arguments of that book is that one core idea of the human world is that it was a shared world. That she has this great metaphor of sitting around a table, and if we're all sitting around a table, the table unites us as part of a world. It's a thing that brings us together. The things that last and present the world, the states, the stories, the tables, the artworks, those are things we share. It's part of what she calls the common world. And what she says is, with the rise of Romanticism, with Rousseau and Herder and others, we increasingly turn away from that common world into a world of introspection, where we can make the world a fictional world of our choosing. And in so doing, we turn away from this common world. And part of what it had meant to be human for Arendt was to be part of a world, a common world that humans built together. And she sees this turn towards introspection and away from the common world as one of the real consequences of what she calls the rise of modern science, insofar as what science does is teaches us to distrust the objective world. It teaches us that what we see and what we hear in our common sense is actually not true. We see, the sun move, but that's not true. And as we see that things aren't what we think, we actually begin to live internally. And so, insofar as Rahel, she's writing this book on Rahel Varnhagen 20 years before The Human Condition. 20 to 23 years before The Human Condition, and good 10 years before The Origins. Insofar as the very ideas of a turn away from a common world, a turn towards introspection, are the themes of this book, which she's writing about at Jewess in Berlin, writing it in 1933 or 30s. Is sort of it's a fascinating thing to think about how over the next 10 and 20 years this world that she develops in thinking about Rahel gets translated first into her thinking about totalitarianism, and then later to her thinking about the human condition. So, as I said, this is the theme. I'm just trying to bring us back to the book. It's for those of us who need help every 2 weeks getting back into it. And we're starting with chapter 6 today. We're going to try and get through chapter 6 and 7. Chapter 6 begins Answers, the Great Good Fortune, 1805 to 1807. So she's again going chronologically through Rahel's life. And in the last, in the second paragraph of chapter 6, she returns us to Rahel Varnhagen's star-crossed love affair with Urquijo, and if we remember, this was her second great love after, and this was one in which she loved him more than he loved her. She knew it, and yet she chose, as Arendt talks about in the last chapter, she chose to accept the fact that the beauty and the fictionality of her love for Urquijo was actually worth accepting, because she didn't want to deal with reality. She said reality had been tempting her again, right? She had recovered from her first love affair. She'd moved to Paris, come back to the world. And yet what she really found is that she would rather live in the fictional unreality, the lying reality of a beautiful, true world as opposed to the real world. And she talks about how for Rahel, she wanted beauty and magic rather than reality. The magic of the moment, and she didn't want to spoil the beauty of the evening, she says. And beauty retains its magic even though reality resists its enchantment. And so this is her reading of this period of Rahel's life where she's in love with this man Urquijo. She knows it's not real. She knows it's going to fail. And yet she holds on to it because she wants that beauty. And that beauty is actually more important to her than the real world. And then this chapter begins in the second paragraph, and I'm going to use the paragraph numbers because I'm in a different edition than many of you. And she says, in losing Urquijo, Rahel lost the beautiful world. So here's this sort of announcement of what this chapter is about. In losing this magical, unreal, fictional, beautiful love, she lost beauty. And she has to turn away from beauty and turn back to the real world. And if you look at the end of this paragraph, so it's the second paragraph of chapter 6, she had given away her senses and had concentrated everything she was upon an object, namely Urquijo, this Spanish lover that she had. And now, having grown unaccustomed to all rule of reason, so she had lived in this magic world, not the world of reason, she pursued it and was blind and deaf and dumb to the beautiful world. All she had left was gruesome pain. So she's returned to reality, the reality of gruesome pain and suffering. She says in the fourth paragraph, this man, this creature wielded the greatest magic over me, still wields it, I sold myself out to him, gave him, this is no cliche, first that I am. I have experienced it. I gave him my whole heart. And once your heart is given, only love and worthiness can give it back. So she's talking about this choice that she makes to give him her heart. And now once that ends, she's set back into the world of pain and unhappiness. And she says everything had become meaningless, a shadow of madness, soul crazed with grief. This is on the next page. So how does one answer this? So the chapter is called Answers, the Great Good Fortune, right? How does she respond to this loss of the magic, to the loss of beauty? And here's another, again, for those who have read some Arendt, here's another really important and fascinating historical marker. She responds by storytelling. She responds by understanding that in the kind of suffering that she's experiencing, life would only be bearable and tellable so long as it was focused solely on suffering and on the confirmation of reality. So she has to now tell her story as a story of suffering, of reality, to bring her back to the real, bring her back to the world. And what she realizes is that the only things that are real in the world are things that are permanent, things that last. And we know from reading Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition that what lasts most of all are works of art, things that we create and that are so meaningful that we establish them as things that will be preserved. Homes, artworks, architecture, buildings, and also political entities, which are works of art, states, or countries. And so she needs, and that in order to make her life a work of art, she had to keep telling it. She had to tell it to people, and she had to make it into a tellable story. And so this is what she begins to talk about in the next series of pages. In the paragraph that begins, it took reiteration to make Rahel learn to dread forgetting. She had to keep telling her life, even with its suffering. And in telling her life with its suffering, she made her life real and brought herself back to reality. She had to build up what Arendt calls a kind of tellable story. And that's what she did. And then in the paragraph, about the fifth page of the text, again in my edition, that begins, unhappiness, suffering, disgrace had been foreseeable. But hatred directed against oneself, loss of pride and security were alien and intolerable. So it's all right to be unhappy and suffering. That's part of life. But to lose your pride in yourself, that's intolerable. And so what she had to do was find pride in her suffering and pride in her having suffered and having loved. And she does that first through this relationship with this woman, Rebecca Friedlander, which we can talk about if you want. But what I think is most interesting and what I want us to get to and talk about in this chapter is that the real path that she finds back to reality is through Goethe, the German poet Goethe. And this is, to me, the fascinating part of Rahel and of Arendt's reading of Rahel. Rahel attaches herself to Goethe, and it was Goethe who, she says, and Arendt says, presented to her the suffering and fullness of reality of life as objective and real. It gave her an assurance that as someone who suffers, she wasn't alone, and that her unhappiness was real, and it made her a real person. it taught her that her sufferings and joys were mortal. But even though they were mortal and thus isolating and making her lonely and making her unhappy and making her seem disconnected from the world, because the very sufferings that she felt were given immortal preservation, immortal objectivity in Goethe's poetry, it made her feel immortal. It made her feel part of not just a disgraced Jew and disgraced woman, but someone who was part of the human story and carried her into the human immortal world. And this is for Arendt in many ways the function of art and poetry, is that it creates an immortal world, a world that lasts, that unites us, and that we feel that even though we will die and we are mortal, it will continue on beyond us, and as a result, we will be part of a larger experience. And I want to just end our discussion of this chapter with a short discussion of poetry, which happens again in my book on 92, but in the paragraph beginning, the generalizing power of poetry is about 3 or 4 pages before the end of the chapter if you're in a different edition. But the paragraph begins, the generalizing power of poetry. And she writes, the generalizing power of poetry is achieved only if it arises out of an ultimate and absolute precision in the use of words. If it takes every word seriously. Thus for Rahel, all of Goethe's words seem indifferent as he uses them from the same words used by other people. Seems different as he uses them from the same words used by other people, words like hope, fidelity, fear. Only in the wholly liberated purity of the poetic, in which all words are, as it were, spoken for the first time, can language become her friend, one to whom she is willing to entrust herself and her unprecedented life. Or Goethe provided her with the language she could speak, or as she read the poet's words, quote, just so my life seems to me, it always seems to me that in the true sense, in the sense torn from the bleeding, living heart, other people do nothing. Again and again, his words freed her from the mute spell of mere happening. So, this is the answer. And the great good fortune of the title of this chapter is that she found Goethe. And Goethe brought her back from from having lost the beautiful world and thus being isolated to being, again, part of the world, now a world that is more of an objective world, not a world of her own fantasy, namely the world created by precise and absolute words in poetry. So let me stop there for a second, because that's the first chapter we read. There's a little bit more, and there's obviously a lot I skipped, and see if there are comments or questions either in the chat or amongst you online. If anyone wants to comment on anything particular I just said, please feel free to, or I can go to comments.
Hi, Roger.
Hi, Sam.
Can you hear? Hi. So I'll just add a couple of things to what you said about the poetry. I think it's interesting that it's Goethe's Wilhelm Meister, which resonates most of all with Rahel. That's what she focuses on. But I want on page 112 in this volume, which is where the section on poetry starts at the very top. The first sentence, neither Rahel's meager answers nor the existence of fellow sufferers had sufficed to assure her a kind of historical existence. And then it goes into this conversation of poetry and what you were just talking about, how poetry for Arendt is related to the durability of the world. And in a more personal sense, poetry is essential in the sense that it can assure us a place in the world. Right. So Arendt talks about the question of remains and what remains recurs throughout all of Arendt's work. And for her, it's always language. Language is more durable than any other art form. And on the paragraph right below the one you read, she says everything that Goethe shows is an essence. And she's really talking, Arendt here, she's describing kind of like Wallace Stevens-esque language poetry, and how the use of everyday language can be transformed into carrying more than the mere representation of the word as we use it in the common sense way. But she says poetry, that is, converts the individual matters of which it speaks into generalities, because it not only employs language as a means for communicating a specific content, but converts language back into its original substance. The function of language is preservation. What it embodies is meant to remain longer than is possible for ephemeral human beings. And I want this really, this echoes with so much of what Arendt says about poetry, but it reminded me of one poem specifically that I translated in collecting Arendt's poems that I wanted to share. It's pretty short, and it's a significant poem because it appears in 3 different variations over the course of her life. It's a poem that she returns to many times, and it's fairly short, and there are different versions of it, but it really echoes this sentiment. And she says, and I think it also echoes with the way that she's understanding Rahel. She says, "And no record from these days, burning into one another, consumed with fire, harming us. The wound of luck becomes stigma, not a scar. There would be no record of these days were it not for your voice saying, allowing it to stay. The poetic word is a place, not a refuge. Were it not for the suffering seen, transcribed into words, were it not for the thoughts twisted into sounds, first spoken in poetry, then sung in song, escaping from sorrow into what remains." And I think that's Arendt poetically wrestling with what she's writing here in essay form and thinking about language as this durable, she's thinking about it as a place, but also as a source of durability that can assure us our existence in the world when the world fails to assure us our existence. Poetry, if nothing else, can hold us. And so I think we've been talking a lot about Arendt's damning critiques of Rahel and the way that she's critical of Rahel's turn away from reality. But this part of Varnhagen almost feels redemptive to me because poetry is so near to Arendt, and Arendt, is willing to extend that to Rahel. Right? There's not much redemptive about her, but she found Goethe, and Goethe gave her a voice. The poet was able to give her a voice when she couldn't find a voice of her own. And I think it's a very powerful part of the book.
Okay, thank you.
There's a lot to be said about Arendt and poetry, but I'll stop talking.
Thanks for that poem, too. Anyone else want to jump in before I try and get to the comments? So Howard had written me over the week based on last week's conversation concerning reality. The anthropologist Jared Zignon, as I understand him, argues that reality is not a phenomena separate from those who experience it. Rather, it is an intersection of multiple relationships that intersect at a particular place and time. Such an understanding changes the conversation. Rahel does not remove herself from reality, but rather changes reality by attempting to exclude certain relationships from here and now. This is something we all do. I suppose the question then becomes, are there consequences both to ourselves and others? And if so, for Arendt, what could be such consequences politically be? So, I don't, on one hand, I mean, I'm not sure this is even a controversial view of reality that this anthropologist brings up, that reality is based on relationships. I mean, I think that's clear, and I think Arendt would accept that. Certainly, in her readings of Montesquieu and others, and in her understandings of the common world, she sees it as a world of interest, of that which is between people. It's not a world that I make myself. I think what her claim about Rahel is that she leaves the world of interest, of common reality, and retreats to a world of her own imagination, in introspection, in her mind, and that this is the world that she then cares more about than the world of reality. Now, in what we're talking about in this chapter, we see her re-entering the real world through poetry and other potential avenues. And in so doing, you could say, well, she now brings her introspective self back into the world. But in fact, I think what Arendt is saying is she has to a certain extent, lose that self of introspection in order to come into the world of Goethe. She has to come into a world that is in accord with the generalizing power of poetry, or as in the paragraph before it that Sam read, that poetry converts the individual matters into generalities, because it not only employs language as a means for communicating a specific content, but converts language back into its original substance. And so I take the claim about the fear of reality and the turn to thinking in Arendt as a turn away from the original substance, as a turn away from the absolute power of language, to a kind of introspective flight where I can be what I want to be. If being a Jew is uncomfortable, I can make myself not a Jew, or I can make myself, anything. Now, we're going to then see her try and actualize that in the world in the Assimilation chapter, and I think a lot of Arendt's critique of assimilation and modern liberalism, including identity politics, is based on an attempt to make a common world based on certain objectifications of our inner world. But I don't think this is first of all, I think that the view of reality is one that Arendt would share. I think the turn to introspection is still quite unreal in Arendt's sense. I know you also had a question about physics, which I'll have to punt on, Howard, but if you want to say something about that, Howard, and tell me if you think that answers your question or not, that would be great. Maybe do you have a good connection this week, Howard? I know last week he had trouble with his connection. Is he there? He may have gotten cut off. Oh, he's there. All right. We'll go to anything else. Anyone else say anything about reality in that sense? Daphne says that Hannah's friend Kurt Blumenfeld also said, "I found my way to Zionism through Goethe," which is true. I think some of you know that for Hannah Arendt, she says that, basically she knew all of Goethe and all of German poetry by heart, and that really was very much her sense of the world. So this is a very personal reading for her. Jack says, famously, E. Cummings wrote, "A poet is somebody who feels and who expresses his feelings through words." That's okay. We're gonna have to push on that, Jack, but we'll get there. That's E. Cummings, not Hannah Arendt. This may sound easy. It isn't, and a lot of people think or believe or know they feel. but that's thinking or believing or knowing, not feeling. And poetry is feeling, not knowing or believing or thinking. Almost anybody can learn to think, oh boy, or believe or know, but not a single human being can be taught to feel. Why? Because whenever you think, you believe, or you know, you're a lot of other people. But the moment you feel, you're nobody but yourself. To be nobody but yourself in a world which is doing its best night and day to make you everybody else means to fight the hardest battle which any human being can fight and never stop fighting. Okay, there's a lot to unpack in this, and it's really quite good. So one thing to say is that for Arendt, thinking is not easy. It's probably the hardest. And to think is to think for oneself. Now, Jack is calling it feel for oneself. I mean, in a way, Jack is using, as far as I understand it, feeling almost like Arendt would use thinking, except the difference is that for Arendt, thinking is a conscious activity in which you seek to expand your mind, to think from the perspective of another, to see the world from the perspective of another, to see the world differently. It's not something that just happens through feeling. Feeling for her is a pathos. It's pathetic, and thus it sort of happens to you, whereas thinking is something you do, and is more active. We actually will see her talk about this in the next chapter, in which she says that what Fichte wants to do is to replace feeling with reason, and create a new and hopeful world based on reason as opposed to feeling and prejudice, and that this is what attracts Rahel to Fichte. Arendt is going to be critical of both a world based on feeling and prejudice, but also a world based on reason that replaces feeling and prejudice. And so she's going to want to hold up, in some sense, thinking, in one sense, thinking, as a way of encountering other people and as different and yet also people I can talk to and engage with, which is what she would call plurality. Jack, this idea that a lot of people think or believe or know they feel, but that's thinking. I'm not sure about that for her. But almost anyone can learn to think or believe or know, but you have to be taught.
Remember, this is Cummings. This isn't me.
Yeah,
this is Cummings, and I just wanted to bring this up because Cummings has this view of what it takes to be a poet.
Yeah,
and he is I felt that was significant or valuable thought in the context of Rahel and Hannah Arendt duking it out as to what the value or meaning of poetry is. So this is from a poet saying, thinking and feeling. He's not rejecting those. He's just saying those do not create poetry. Poetry comes out of something else, which is only something that's inside you and not anything that you can learn. Something that you response. That's the way he thinks about it.
That's a very romantic view of poetry. It's not Hannah Arendt's view of poetry, which is not to say one's right and one's wrong. Hannah Arendt's view of poetry is that poetry comes out of the precise two parts. One, an isolating oneself from the world so that one sees the world in new and original ways, differently than the way most people see them. That's the thinking aspect for Arendt. You have to retreat from the world into solitude. You can't be an artist without solitude. You can't be an artist if you're not a pariah, if you're not outside of the common consensual common sense, because what an artist does is sees things originally. And so you have to isolate, you have to bring yourself out of the world and see it differently. And then two, you have to express that with incredible precision. And if you're a poet, that's with words. If you're a visual artist, that's with images. You know, if you're a theater artist, that's with, you know, performance. If you're an architect, it's with buildings. But that's the artistry to with precision and absoluteness present the original idea that you had as an artist. There's very little feeling involved in that. And it isn't, again, Arendt has a very classical view of art in that sense that's totally opposed to the sort of romantic subjectivist view of art that someone like E. Cummings is going to express. So, not saying she's right.
For a second, Roger?
What?
Can I jump in for a second? So I mean, I want to call so Cummings isn't really a romantic poet in the tradition of the Romantics. He's an experimental avant-garde poet who plays with grammar and linguistic structure in order to think about objects and feelings and experiences through language. I think if we look at the kind of poetry that Arendt was drawn to, if we look at the kind of poetry that Arendt was drawn to in her writing and the poets that she cites, so René Char springs to mind as someone she falls back on quite a bit. He's not writing, he's certainly writing about feelings, and Arendt's own poems are certainly about feelings in certain ways, but they're always reflective of lived experiences. So René Char's Hypnos Waking is, essentially a poetic diary of being a French resistance fighter. He was also studying philosophy with Heidegger. But Arendt is drawn, not all poets write about the same things. And poetry for Arendt is a way that we record experience. It necessarily, thinking for Arendt requires solitude. And I think that writing in that sense would, require solitude, but she says all thought moves from experience. What's more important than anything else is that the poem is not so much a reflection of like the immediacy of a feeling that we often associate with a romanticism that puts the pen to the paper to produce the poem. But as when Roger's saying taking a step back, it's the act of reflecting in the imagination on the experience and recording it in language. And that's part of what gives the poem durability in the world. E. Cummings was a very different kind of poet than what Arendt grew up with, just temporally, and what she was drawn to in her own writing. But I think there's some relationship between like E. Cummings and Randall Jarrell, and Arendt was very close with Randall Jarrell, and I think she helped translate some of his writing. So I'm sure she was probably reading Cummings. It would be interesting to see if there are any of his volumes in her library, but I'm not sure. It would be silly to say feelings are not important to the way Arendt thinks about poetry, because feelings are very present in her poems and in the way that she writes about poems. But it's not the essential object that she's after.
I'd like to add, thank you so much, Sam. That really says what I wanted to say, more or less, in response to Roger. So thank you very much for that.
You're welcome, Jack.
But I do want to point out that the key point of this quote is the necessity to fight, and to fight against the efforts of the world to make you something that you are not, or to define you in a way that you aren't. And in that way, I think he is very close to Arendt. And even though he comes at it from a totally different perspective, but what he's trying to describe here is the effort of being a poet, how much effort it takes, what a struggle it is to write poetry, and the reason that he gives is that it's not a matter of just thinking or knowing or believing, which everybody can somehow do. But somehow finding words for the way you feel, finding the words is, I think, what he's mostly interested in. And I think if you read his
Yes.
poetry, you see that it's all a struggle to find the right words to get at something that's very new, very fresh, and very different from what other people are thinking. And that's the way he thinks about poetry. And quite frankly, it's the way I think about it too.
It's
Yeah,
Yeah,
unfortunate.
the way you
that's
just
fair.
described it there, Jack, actually reminds me of how I might describe Heidegger. Um, because he's manipulating language in order to come up with a vocabulary that speaks to that gives form to the reality that he wants to craft. And I think that's an interesting tension. Does the poem represent one's experience of reality fully subjectively, or is there something else transcendent contained within the poem?
Can I just say something?
Yes.
I just wanted to say it's too bad that Cummings is now trying to sell Volvos or something like that, because that is the advertising slogan that they're using in the world where you want to be nothing but yourself when everyone is doing that particular quote. So it's really hard to compare that to anything that Hannah Arendt ever wrote.
Yes, when I quoted this, my wife said that it's in a commercial, TV commercial, which I hadn't seen. So she said that it's very cheapened in the way that a lot of great
Hmm.
art is cheapened by commercials.
Well,
I'm thinking of Dylan and Beatles and so on and so forth. But
don't throw Dylan in there.
I'm
But
just talking about.
I think Jack, the first part of the quote, it is a big, what Daphne says is really important. This quote, and I think Arendt would have trouble with it because it creates a kind of mass culture sense of poetry. A poet is anyone who feels and who expresses his feelings in words. That's everyone. Just because I speak and I express my feelings in words doesn't make me a poet. So Cummings is being both, I think, playful there, but there's also a sense of seriousness that I think Arendt would fundamentally disagree with. An artist is somebody set apart from the masses of men. Not everyone is an artist. It's
Yeah, and I think
elitist.
that's the rebellion we have against feeling, Jack. You think feeling is something that's hard to do and only, and that's fine. It's just a question of what we understand by feeling. But the worry that I have is that when you talk about feeling in this way is that, well, I feel angry, so I'm going to write a poem about anger, or I feel, sad, and I'm going to write a poetry. And, this is what a lot of poetry, a lot of bad poetry is today. It's people sort of putting their feelings on the page. And that's what Hannah Arendt thought a lot of modern art was too, was people just putting their feelings on art on the page of paper. And she really she was in a struggle against that view of art, and that is very upsetting. I've talked to a lot of art schools about Hannah Arendt, and when I talk about this, they get very upset. That that's what a lot of them think art is today: is to paint your feelings or to express yourself, and that's exactly what she did not want art to be. She wanted art to be an expression of thoughts that one had in response to experience, but that were then clarified through thinking and made into a kind of absolute language. And that's different. Now, Cummings, I think, is better than this description that he gives of himself. So I think we can agree on that. I think he certainly does that. But a lot of what Cummings also expresses is a personal view of the world. Well, that's controversial. He's trying to give a structure through his sentence breaks and everything. And I think he's actually trying to say something about the world. And that would be his thinking from Arendt's point of view. Let's just move a little bit on because there's some questions, and then I want to get on to the next chapter, which is a really important break and important beginning of thinking for us about the new part of the book. So Johanna writes, is not Rahel's focus on her suffering isolating her from worldly events and the events of her life? It seems that for Arendt, it is the kind of participation that we actually crave as humans, and that life demands participation in the world, the public. It also seems to me the kind of retreating into a world created by the individual is what we observe in our world today, especially through our use of social media. How can we identify with others when we isolate ourselves? Yeah, I mean, Johanna, I think that's exactly right. This is her critique of Rahel, is that she retreats from the world, and as you said, in her focus on her suffering, she retreats from the world. Now, but here's where I'll make a slight pushback to what you just said, is that when she retreats from the world, and she does that in a couple ways. One is by creating this positive view of herself, right, as this great leader of Salon, and as someone who is able to transcend being Jewish. That's a retreat from the world. And then also in her love for, I always can't pronounce his name, Urquiju, again, there's a retreat from the world into beauty and magic. In this particular case, she turns to suffering as something that is hers. You're right. But what brings her out of that retreat back into the world is Goethe, and is Goethe's expression of suffering as not subjective, but as human, as universal, as conceptual, generalizable. And insofar as Rahel reads and understands Goethe, which is of course questionable, but fine, she embraces her suffering not as her suffering, but as her suffering that is a reflection of and part of human suffering, and thus part of the world. And I think that's so. Insofar as we retreat into social media and we create profiles and we create images for ourselves or stories that are our own and not part of the world and not part of an absolute language and not with precision of words, yeah, we're just presenting ourselves and our feelings, and we're actually not joining a public world. But insofar as we read great poetry, we do. It's funny. I was actually in Washington D.C. yesterday, meeting with some very interesting people, and we got into a conversation about comic books. I hate to say it, but we did, because my son reads comic books, and one of them got very upset and said comic books are the ruin of the world. And I said, how is so? And they said, well, because we read comic books instead of Homer. And okay, it was an interesting point, right? Because in reading comic books instead of Homer, we have Spider-Man and X-Men and Wolfman and all these things, and we don't have a common story. Every different culture has its own comics and things, and we lose that common world. On the other hand, the comic books, in a way, retell the same themes of Homer over and over again, and of Bible and of Brothers Grimm and everyone else. And so in a way, we keep the ideas alive, but we lose that common sense. But the real problem is that Homer has been translated and written in such a way that its language presents a world that became a common world for hundreds of years, whereas Batman hasn't. And it's that lack of the absoluteness of the words in comic books that I think separates it. And that's what I would say separates something like Facebook from Goethe, right? In Johanna's question. Does that make sense, Johanna? I mean, I don't know how you feel about that. So you want to jump in?
Actually, it does make sense. I'm very interested that she is so, how should I say, handicapped by her suffering in so many ways. She doesn't, while she might acknowledge that that reading Goethe, she sees suffering in a more universal way, but what she says doesn't indicate that. This is in the way that I'm reading it. So I see that that she's retreated into a world of her own, and that sort of like that self-absorption, I think is detrimental in her, and as we read her and read about her life, because she cannot get beyond that. I think the greatest of all writers and the greatest of all thinkers are the ones who can see themselves really universally, and whatever suffering they have is a mirror or an empathetic relationship with others who suffer, lest we become sniveling victims. And this, I feel I try not to be cynical, but she seems so self-absorbed that I cannot feel empathy for her.
I think that's a really good point. If you look at near the end of this chapter, so about 3 pages before the end, the paragraph that begins, Rahel acquired to the point of mastery. And this comes near the end of the discussion of Goethe, and Arendt says, Rahel acquired to the point of mastery the art of representing her own life. The point was not to tell the truth, but to display herself, not always to say the same thing to everyone, to each what was appropriate for him. She learned that only as a specific person could one say something specific in such a way that it would be listened to. So, here's where I think part of the critique of Rahel that Johanna just brought up is now being brought in. She wasn't Goethe. She didn't speak the truth of suffering. She was really interested in representing her own life, and she found in Goethe a way to present herself. And then 2 paragraphs below that, she writes, in the paragraph begins, she had learned that the pure subjectivity which makes a point of bearing a world within itself is doomed, because this inner world is never able to replace what is merely given to human beings. And so she learned that she could not live in this mere inner life. But she doesn't yet have the power of Goethe to obviously create another world. She writes in the next paragraph, she had learned that love could guarantee the whole of human life only occasionally, that such love came only as an unpredictable stroke of fortune. And even then it could do so, only if it transformed itself and ceased to be the richness of alien worlds. She saw how Goethe and Wilhelm Meister made all those die whom love had been the whole of life. So love is not what's going to guarantee life to us, for the most part. Here is what she's saying. And so she learned that she had to leave love itself and move into the world of suffering. In the last 2 paragraphs of this chapter, I want to just focus on them and then move into the next chapter. She talks about how she needs to learn to display herself, to go about, and that part of what she had to learn was to lose her Jewishness, to normalize herself as a Jew. She says that to remain a Jew would be defiant and prideful, and in order to become a person in the world, a person with meaning in the world, she would have to cover the nakedness of Jewishness with, as it were, a dress. The Jew must be extirpated from us, she wrote. That is the sacred truth. And she changes her name first to Rahel Robert and then to Friederike Robert, as a way of normalizing herself and escaping her Jewishness. She does this at this point in her life, 1806 to 1810, 1807, 1808, because the avenues for being a German and a Jew suddenly shut down in Germany in this time. Arendt refers to this as the tragedy of 1806, or the disaster of 1806. And in 1806, what happened is Napoleon defeated the Holy Roman Empire, and in one sense, Napoleon brought in laws that emancipated the Jews. So this was the time of actually the greatest legal rights for Jews in Germany. But what happened is, in Prussia, is that the nobility and the romantics, who had previously accepted the Jews and gone to Jewish salons and seen Jews as at least interesting exceptions, suddenly became German nationalists and expressed their German nationalism against French, Jewish, and women culture. And they excluded women and Jews and French from the salons. They made the salons more exclusive, and they came back a kind of social prejudice into Germany. And even though Rahel tried to change with the times and became a diehard German nationalist and a German patriot, nothing could work. She couldn't break into the sort of new prejudiced German society. And so she eventually has to assimilate and change her name. She's left with a choice, really, and all Jews are, Arendt says, between demanding emancipation and actually fighting to preserve Judaism within an emancipated society, or baptizing themselves and claiming their entry ticket to European society. I want to point out two things that I think are really interesting in the last 4 or 5 pages of this chapter. The first is that Arendt identifies a paradox, which I think is paradoxical against the common wisdom, and one that I think many of us would find surprising, which is that if you want to save Judaism, you can't support Reform Judaism. The support for Reform Judaism makes it easier to be a Jew, and thus to assimilate, and thus will eventually lead to the extirpation of Judaism. If you want to save Judaism, you have to preserve Jewishness as orthodoxy. Fewer people will be Jews, but Jews will continue to exist. And so this becomes sort of this paradox that Arendt suggests, that the rise of Reform Judaism makes it easier for Jews to assimilate, makes more people stay Jewish, but they're not Jewish, and they end up assimilating, and in the end they will baptize themselves when needed. And Reform Judaism is actually a great danger to the furtherance of Judaism. So that's the first point that I thought she made that I thought was interesting. And the second is that Rahel assimilated by way of Fichte, the German philosopher Fichte, student of, or contemporary student of Hegel's. And Fichte has an idea in his essay, The Address to the German Nation, that Rahel read, that we have to educate a new generation for a new world, and that man has the power to reshape the world. So this is that sort of subjectivism, this radical subjective idealism of Fichte, but we can remake the world according to reason, and that there's a new rational science that we can use to make the world, and that the new and hopeful world, which will exist on new pillars of equal citizenship, where reason replaces feeling and prejudice. This is Fichte's idea that Rahel embraces. And it means that Rahel embraces this idea that we can all become sort of universal German citizens, in which we are not Jews or women or Frenchmen or Roma or whatever, but we're all just burghers, citizens. And what, in I think one sentence, Arendt destroys this idea. The fourth paragraph from the end that begins to belong to this new community. She says, to belong to the new community, then, Rahel needed only to annihilate herself and her origin, her sensuous existence, which for many reasons she'd been trying to do for a long time. As she had written to her brother, the Jew must be extirpated from us. That is the sacred truth. And so what Arendt finds in the will to assimilate, and this is part of her critique of assimilation, which carries with her basically her whole life, which is that to assimilate is to annihilate your origin and who you are and your sensuous existence. Arendt herself, some people might think of her as an assimilated Jew. I don't think that's how she thought of herself. I think she thought of herself as a Jew who also had other sides to herself, but she never wanted to be forced to give up that Jewishness, and certainly not when it was attacked. As she said, when I'm attacked as a Jew, I defend myself as a Jew. But I'll stop here for a second. There's more to talk about, but why don't I see if there's questions or comments? Anyone want to talk about this chapter on assimilation?
Can I jump in here for a second, Roger?
Yeah.
This quote at the end of the chapter on assimilation is a repeat of the quote at the end of the previous chapter, in which we see it more amply, where she describes that nakedness of Jewishness that you quoted before, where she describes it as a shame that she experiences all the time. She drinks it in wine, she drinks it in water, and so on and so forth. It's a shame that she has to extirpate the Jewishness from her. And I think I just want to express the idea that for Jewish people, when it is associated with shame, assimilation is one thing, and when it is not associated with shame, it is something different. And I'm thinking now specifically of American Jewry, much of which is Reform, right, and which doesn't carry the full religious content of the Orthodox, clearly, and continually moves away from that. And nevertheless, the feeling of being Jewish never departs. People who are Reform Jews are very self-consciously Jewish, if nothing else. They may assimilate in every other way, but they demand to be Jewish, right? They demand to be called Jewish, recognized as Jewish. And this is very different from being ashamed of being Jewish. And I really want to make that distinction about the feeling that Rahel has that is driving her to assimilation and what other people may be feeling who assimilate.
I think what's interesting, Jack, is that's right. And the reason Rahel was opposed to Reform Judaism was because she felt that if Reform Judaism existed, she could still be a Jew and also be a German.
Yeah.
And that would be a disaster for her because if she stayed as a Jew, she would still be a Jew.
Right.
And so, I think for a lot of us today, you and I don't want to presume, but I assume are somewhat Reform Jews. That's the benefit of Reform Judaism, is that we can be, regular old American citizens and yet still call ourselves Jews when we want to. 5 days a year, I'm Jewish and I feel good about it. And the rest of the time, it's not that big a deal. Okay, that's Some of you are shaking
Well,
your head.
I would describe myself differently because I'm not even Reform. I
Yeah,
have no religious practice
right.
whatsoever.
But you
And yet I
identify
define
as a
myself as, I don't only identify, I define myself as Jewish.
you define yourself as Jewish, and that's exactly what Rahel doesn't want.
Yeah.
And what she says is that the more you define yourself as Jewish, then you're Jewish, and then you're still going to be always subject to anti-Semitism and discrimination. And she wanted to get away from that, and she thought that the easier it was to be a Jew, the harder it would be to actually assimilate. Um, um, it's much easier for her to escape Orthodox Jews because you say, I'm not them, and therefore I'm just not Jewish. But when you have the option, it's much harder. And so it's just one of those paradoxical things, which is that you make it easier to be Jewish. You actually keep, in a way, keep anti-Semitism alive because there's more Jews and they're in this weird spot of being both Jewish and not Jewish. And then you get this whole stuff of being unreliable and not good, not patriotic, and all that stuff that Jews get accused of being.
They're going to get accused of that in any case. As you know, I'm a refugee from Nazi Germany, and so I've learned nothing else in my life. I've learned that once you're a Jew, you are a Jew, regardless of what you do, how you say it, or how you try to evade it. The world will always have you as Jewish.
Yeah.
Can I jump in for a minute?
Yeah.
If you live in Israel, there are no distinctions between Reform and Orthodox and Conservative. It's all one. And there's a perpetual struggle with the Orthodox attempting to make the entire country Orthodox. The laws, civil laws, are all maintained by the rabbinate. So even if you feel that you are secular, you are confined by Orthodox laws in many ways. So I'm not sure I agree with you that saying that sort of the Reform Judaism and that was what Hannah Arendt believed. I'm not sure that I agree that she believed that Reform Judaism was the end of Judaism. I think in many ways, the German Jews were very much intellectuals ahead of other Jews of Europe. And I think that the total blockage by the Orthodox of any secular knowledge would have been a disaster. I mean, we wouldn't have Judah Menuhin. We wouldn't have had so many of the great minds and the artists that came out of mostly, a lot of them obviously German Jews, but the rest of the world, if we had been confined only to Orthodox Jewry, which is one of the problems that I think Israel today is facing, is that struggle between the enormous pressure by the Orthodox community to make all Jews very Jewish and have no breadth. There is that whole idea of assimilation or being like the rest of the world is a negative pressure. I'm not expressing this very well, but
No, but I'm going to try and I think it's an important point, Daphne. So let me see if I get it, and you can tell me if I do, because I don't think Arendt. I mean, certainly she's not saying we should all be Orthodox Jews. I mean, that's what Rahel wants to say. We should only have Orthodoxy and no Reform. I think one quote that's coming to me, and it's not going to get it exactly right, is, and Sam might have it in her head, is she writes to Gershom Scholem that she once was in Israel, and I think it was Golda Meir or somebody said, the greatness of the Jewish people. I'm not religious. I don't care about religion, but I care about being Jewish. And Arendt says to Scholem, I didn't say anything at the time because I was so shocked, but what I would have said if I had thought about it and been able to at the time was, the greatness of the Jewish people used to be that they believed in God. And so even if you're Reformed, to some degree, I think for Arendt, there's a sense that to be Jewish is to be part of the Jewish religion. And Now, there's another part of being Jewish, which is that if you're attacked as a Jew, you defend yourself as a Jew. I think that's something different.
Yeah, but she was very
Yeah.
close. She was very close to people like Martin Buber,
Yeah.
whose Judaism was a completely non-orthodox type of Judaism. It was mystical. It was the whole idea of the interaction between the creative and the theological. And she admired Franz Rosenzweig and his theological existentialism. So I don't think we would have that if it were true that we couldn't have Reform Judaism.
There's a
I'm
really
not saying we can't.
there's a really
Not saying
good
we can't have.
essay this week, and there's a really good essay this week that I think is making Roger's point in Tablet. I don't know if anyone saw it. It's by Eliyahu Stern on how Orthodox Jewish people are actually abetting Donald Trump's anti-Semitism. And the whole first part of the essay talks about, I think, what Arendt is picking up here, which is that during this time in Germany, the Orthodox rabbis actually directly appealed to Hitler, saying that it was the Reform Jews who they wanted and not the Orthodox Jews, because the Orthodox Jews who had a faith, who were practicing their Judaism, were not a threat to what it was the Nazis were saying, and that it could be a Lebensraum within a Lebensraum, that they could make room for them within the room of the Nazis. And this was, I think, this is just a kind of historical framework for thinking about this question that Arendt was attuned to, is how I understand that. This piece is worth reading. I have one minor pedantic point to make. Hegel came after Fichte, but they were contemporaries with one another. But it's important to anyone who's interested in, I think, Kant's influence on Arendt, and the phenomenology's influence on Arendt, because Fichte is developing Kant's idea of self-consciousness in a way toward the individual, which is precisely what Hegel is going to criticize Fichte for, if my philosophical education serves me. And Hegel's going to push us toward this idea of a developed self-consciousness that is not this kind of Fichtean individual in the world transcendentalism. But I haven't had a class on phenomenology in a while, but it's Kant, Fichte, Hegel, for anybody who's wondering.
Any other thoughts here on a similar? So, I mean, the question of Jewish orthodoxy or not, I mean, Arendt was certainly not against Reform Judaism, at least not that I know of. If anyone knows otherwise, you can tell me. I was just trying to point out, that there is this paradoxical thing that Reform Judaism can lead to an easier assimilation, but not a full assimilation that Rahel found important. The other part of this essay, this last chapter, which I which I tried to mention, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on, because I mean, this is one of the more fascinating and controversial aspects of Arendt's work in general, is the question of assimilation, which is what this chapter is called. Arendt was a Jew, always felt you should identify as a Jew and be defended, especially when you're attacked as a Jew. What she loved about the United States in her letters that she wrote back to Europe was that in the United States was like the one place, she said, where you could be comfortable as a Jew and as an American. Whereas in Europe, you either had to be a Jew or a German. You couldn't really be both. That was her critique of, the German and European nation state system. And this is a critique she has of all nation states. But in the end, what she's really interested in saying is assimilation is a betrayal of your origin, and that you should never, I don't say never, but that she thinks that assimilation is, I don't know. I don't think she would say you should never do it. I mean, I think people do it all the time, but I think there's no doubt she's critical of pariahs, those who want to assimilate, and to the extent that Rahel was a parvenu, these parvenus who want to assimilate. To the extent Rahel was one, Arendt is critical of her. What do you guys think of this approach to assimilation, to thinking about assimilation?
I'll take a stab at it. My family left Germany between 1850 and 1870, and they were incredibly assimilationist when they came to the U.S. But that assimilation was not about denying that they were Jews. And so I guess I agree with Jack. I think he said earlier, if it's coming from a shame, my grandfather started a business with a man who was not Jewish, and they went out to lunch every day in the Bellevue, Stratford, in Philadelphia. And I think it was very important for him to be seen there. But in his social life, all his friends were Jewish. He was not trying to become part of a non-Jewish social milieu. So he made a distinction, I guess, between business and his social life. But I mean, they had Christmas trees. There were many areas where they were very assimilationist, but it was never to deny themselves as Jews. They belonged to a synagogue and so forth. And we're talking pre-World War II, because I think a lot of things changed for many Jews who were assimilationists prior to World War II. But this was, going back to my great-great-grandparents, there was no attempt to deny their being Jewish.
I think I'd like to add something about my family because because of course that's a story that I know and not other people's. My parents left Poland following World War I because they wanted to go to Germany where Jews could live safely as opposed to Poland. And so they moved to Germany. And then, of course, when Hitler came to power, they knew immediately what was going to happen because they were very sensitive to anti-Semitism. And they spent the next few years trying to get out of there and managed to come here. Not everybody was so successful in my family. And when they came here, they were what you would call today Orthodox. My grandfather was the shamus of the Yasla synagogue, so there's a transmission of orthodoxy, and gradually the orthodoxy fell away, partially because of the requirements of life in America. They could not possibly have made a living without working on Saturday, as it turned out, in the business that they selected. And then it was very hard to keep strictly kosher because there were so many reasons for the children to eat outside the house. That was really what gradually caused the kashrut to go away. But I often heard these tales about moving to Germany and the difference between them and the German Jews who looked down upon them. And when we came to this country, there were German Jewish refugees from Hitler who thought that this influx of Eastern European Jews would actually cause some taking of other people's jobs and stuff like that, give rise to anti-Semitism because these Eastern European Jews didn't know how to behave. They didn't know how to be.
Jack, that's true also in Israel. The influx of Jews from East Europe caused an enormous fear and a reaction because they were going to make Israel poor and inefficient and uneconomic and illiterate. That was the sentiment against Jews from East Europe.
So there you have it. Thank you, Daphne, for that confirmation.
Hi, can I jump in? This is Margaret.
Yes.
You can hear me, right? Okay. I guess I'm coming at it from a slightly different perspective in the sense that, I mean, all four grandparents were, Eastern European Jews. Families came over in the various ways that they did, all post-World War. What I saw with my parents, very much the denial. I mean, the assimilation to the point of utter and complete denial of that identity, an attempt to cut off the historical. And one of the things that resonates most for me in this is the sort of underpinning that you don't get to do that. Just don't get to do that. Partly because the history, and you don't get to decide these on your own. And so, I think it's fascinating. I mean, I watch, for example, parents born that, towards the end of life, suddenly deciding that now they're Jewish. So I guess one of the things that, I see in this is it's similar to Christian patient.
I can't hear Margaret. Can anyone else? Margaret, I can't hear you.
Can't hear me? Can anybody hear me?
You're just going a little bit in and out. Your connection may not be perfect, or you're speaking not near the mic. I'm not sure which.
Sorry, because I'm practically on. But I guess what I was talking about was just the.
Margaret, Margaret, I'm sorry. Maybe you could write it down because we're having a lot of trouble hearing you now. I heard most of it.
Yeah, hold on. Okay.
I'm sorry about that. Anyone else want to jump in on this?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think, Roger, what you're saying, or what she's saying about the assimilation is a betrayal, is really interesting in terms of the shame that's associated with identifying yourself as other in a country. And I was thinking about this in terms of, I'm not Jewish, but I'm Italian American. And my father was of the older generation, so he was born in 1926. And at that particular time, Italian, was shameful to be Italian. And I can see that for my father, for example, he always held on to those ties very strongly, whereas the rest of his siblings, kind of changed the pronunciation of their names and were very much, not into saying that they were Italian. And so it's interesting in terms of what happens in this country, because, I don't know about anyone out there, but for my generation, when I was in high school and stuff like that, a common question that we would ask amongst ourselves was, where are you from? Which is a strange question to ask when we're all from the United States, but we all understood what that meant, meaning that our roots were elsewhere. And so in this, this has sort of been building as we've been reading this, sort of a funny synchronicity thing. I was speaking to somebody about a class that an organization offers called Undoing Racism. And I thought that was really interesting, and how do you teach that with Undoing Racism? And basically what they said is that you have to first identify what white culture is, and then everyone in response to that. And so in order to be accepted into white culture, certain cultures have had to assimilate in order for their culture to disappear. So in a sense, it's this really interesting kind of paradox, because in one sense, we migrate, we're moving, and thus we're going to influence one another, especially just in today's world. And then at the same time, how do you still hold on to, in a sense, maybe that's not the right word, but still have that tie to where it is that you originally come from? And so really it's funny because it's I in reading Arendt, I really don't know the answer. I don't even know how quite to respond, because on the one hand, you want to keep that tie. And then on the other hand, you can't necessarily help the fact that we're influenced by the world as it exists around us. Thus the common reality changes. And so what is our responsibility as human beings to respond to that common reality, though it's different? You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, that's right. And I think that is very much Arendt's aim or her drive, which is to say that our responsibility is to live in a common world, but also have a private world and also have a social world. And this is where, she gets into, all sorts of trouble with her essay on Little Rock and other places, where she wants to say, look, in the public world, you have to treat everyone as equal. You have to treat everyone as citizens. But they have to be able to come there as citizens, as Jewish citizens, as Italian Americans, as Black Americans, as African Americans, as Islamic Americans, as Muslim Americans, whatever it is, and be treated as equal as citizens. But they also have to be able to, if they want, discriminate in the social realm and hang out with Muslims or Jews or Blacks or whites. And, this is where obviously she gets into trouble, which is to say that discrimination for her is an essential part of humanity in the social realm and to a certain extent in the private realm, where uniqueness would be the principle as opposed to discrimination. But these are going to be a lot of the kind of discussions we're going to have at our conference in October on racism and anti-Semitism, because these are some of the real issues that Arendt's thinking about these topics on assimilation and race and anti-Semitism bring up.
So this is, Roger, the paradox of the pluralism as described by Hannah Arendt, that in order to people to walk around calling this place a nation of immigrants, right? And in order to be a nation, in order to be American, you have to some extent, abandon wherever it was that you came from and become American. When I grew up, my sister would not permit me to speak any language but English because she had been going into teenage in Germany, in Germany.
Let me just respond to that, Jack, because I think that's the experience a lot of people have. That's the assimilationist experience of America. What Arendt was struck by when she came here, and she came here at a specific time, obviously, was that Jews in America didn't have to do that. They could if they want, but they could remain Jewish. They could have all Jewish friends. They could speak Yiddish or German. And you have Chinatowns where people speak Chinese, and you have, Little Italy where people speak Italian. And what she was struck by was that this was the one country that she had ever encountered where you could still be fully Jewish or fully German or fully Italian or fully Chinese or whatever it was you were, and also, as that, participate in the quote-unquote American political public world. The fact that some people chose not to, they chose to assimilate, the reason Arendt was critical of that was because she didn't think they had to. And she thought they were doing it for social climbing reasons, as she says in the article on Little Rock, not for political reasons, not because they needed to in order to have a public life. She called it parvenu mentality, seeking to rise up and gain entry into a particular social realm that doesn't want you. And that's a controversial claim on her part. A lot of people would call it racist or other things. I think it's important to take it seriously and try and understand it. So I'm sorry,
in today's Jewry, there is a controversy. I guess the best way to put it. There is a controversy as to whether Jews are white or not. Are Jews white people? And this is a very serious controversy because they're mixed into this whole idea, or rather mixed into the current conversation in Jewry. I think that's the way in American Jewry is this. There is this mixture of, on the one hand, the shame that drives assimilation, the shame, and on the other, the shame of not being sufficiently consonant with other minorities and other people who are oppressed. And and those are the things that are in conflict. And it's pretty amazing to me with the kinds. I've read some stuff that that would cause your hair to stand on end.
Maria, did you want to add something? I saw you. It looked like you wanted to add something. Got to turn on your mic if you want to.
Yeah, no, not specifically to that, but so I was waiting till this thought was finished because it made me think about
Well, we're
something
almost
someone said.
done. We're almost done, so you get the last thought then.
Okay. So well, it's funny because I was like, we got into this little, we took this detour into feelings, and listening to everybody's personal connection to this work and their experiences. It's funny because I feel Hannah is like a person with a very fine-tuned feeling instrument. I don't know if someone could have come up with the break from belonging as an idea without sensating that, because that is a feeling to break from belonging. That's a very real separation that happens. And what's for me, one of the things about feelings, not the interpretation of feelings, the feelings as like a pure, as they are. They're not a concept. Feelings are. They just exist. But then, really, the subtlety of the feeling, the subtlety that the break from belonging, you can feel it in every example that has been kind of put forth during this conversation. And so in a sense, it's like, I don't feel that it's really about the mind or feelings versus the intellect or whatever it is, but I think that it is in her processing of her feelings using her mind that is, that gives it clarity. And so just to kind of put that in the end, because that sort of came up as a feeling, which is a very real thing, whether I was clear or not might just be another question entirely. Okay.
Excellent. No, thank you very much. We'll come back to these question of feelings, so I appreciate that. We're going to read in 2 weeks. Sam is going to lead it in 2 weeks, I believe, and it's going to be day and chapters 9 and what are we on? Chapters 8 and 9, day and night, and the beggar by the wayside. And this gets into her relationship with Mr. Varnhagen. Finally, she gets married after all these attempts. We always forget there's actually like a romance story here somewhere along the way. So we'll continue on in 2 weeks. For those of you who are big Amor Mundi readers, we apologize for the technical difficulties last week. They'll be fixed, I hope, soon. You'll have another newsletter on Sunday. Thank you all very much, and hope you enjoy continuing to read Hannah Arendt. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, everybody.